Greetings to all, and warm welcome to all of you. Come with me in the inner experience. Some notes on contemplation. And our study is the awakening of the inner self. This is your Pastor Yeti. From what has been said, it is clear that there is and can be no special plan technique for discovering and awakening one's inner self. Because the inner self is, first of all, a spontaneity that is nothing if not free. And therefore, there is no use in trying to start with a definition of the inner self, and then deducing from its essential proportions some appropriate and infallible means of submitting it to control. As if the essence could give us some clue to that which is vulnerable in it. Sometimes we can lay hold of in order to gain power over it. Such an idea would imply a complete misapprehension of the existential reality we are talking about. The inner self is not a part of our being like a motor in a car. It is our entire substantial reality itself on its highest and most personal and most existential level. It is like life, and it is life. It is our spiritual life when it is most alive. It is the life by which everything else in us lives and moves. It is in and through and beyond everything that we are aware. If it is awakened, it communicates a new life to the intelligence in which it lives, so that it becomes a living awareness of itself. And this awareness is not so much something that we ourselves have as something that we are. It is a new and indefinable quality of our living beings. The inner self is as secret as God, and, like Him, it evades every concept that tries to seize hold of it with full possession. It is a life that cannot be held and studied as object, because it is not a thing. It is not reached and coaxed or coaxed forth from hiding by any process under the sun, including meditation. All that we can do with any spiritual discipline is produce within ourselves something of the silence, the humility, the detachment, the purity of heart, and the indifferences which are required if the inner self is to make some shy, unpredictable manifestations of His presence. At the same time, however, every deeply spiritual experience, whether religious, moral, or even artistic, tends to have in it something of the presence of the interior self. And only from the inner self does any spiritual experience gain depth, reality, and certain incommunicability. But the depth of ordinary spiritual experience only gives us a derivative sense of the inner self. It reminds us of the forgotten levels of the interiority in our spiritual nature and of our helplessness to explore them. And nevertheless, a certain cultural and spiritual atmosphere favors the secret and spontaneous development of the inner self. The ancient cultural traditions, both of the East and of the West, having a religious and sapential nature, favored the interior life, indeed transmitted certain common materials in the form of archetypal symbols, liturgical notes, art, poetry, philosophy, and myth, which nourish the inner self from childhood to maturity. In such a cultural setting, no one needs to be self-conscious about his interior life, and subjectivity does not run the risk of being deviated into morbidity and excess. Unfortunately, such a cultural setting no longer exists in the West or is no longer common property. It is something that has to be laboriously recovered by an educated and enlightened minority. An example from Zen. Although, as we speak, is mainly concerned with Christian mysticism, we might profitably pause to consider an example of inner awakening taken from an Oriental text. It is a cryptic and telling instant of interior self-realization, and the elements in the experience are so clearly set out that they provide an almost clinically a perfect test case in the natural order. This is an account of the Satori, a spiritual enlightenment, a bursting open of the inner core of the spirit to reveal the inmost self. This takes place in the peace of what we might ordinarily call contemplation, but it breaks through suddenly and by surprise. Beyond the level of quiet contemplative absorption, showing that mere interior peace does not suffice to bring us in contact with our deepest liberty. The thing that is most helpful about this example is that it makes no claims whatever to be supernatural or mystical. Zen is, in a sense, anti-mystical. Hence it permits us to observe the natural working of the inner self. In fact, the chief spoken for Zen today, T.D. Suzuki, goes through some pains to contrast this spiritual event with Christian mystical experience, laying stress on its natural character as a purely psychological phenomenon. And hence no one will be offended if we pressure to examine this as a psychological case, showing the workings of the inner self, presumably without any influence of the mystical grace, and whether or not such an experience is actually possible without grace and on a purely natural level, and whether it might be possible to contradict Suzuki and to call it mystical might from the subject of a provocative study. At the moment, for the sake of convenience, I am taking Suzuki's words and accepting the example exactly as he presents it and on his own terms, as a purely natural, empirical fact. Satori, which is the very heart and essence of Zen, is a revolutionary spiritual experience in which, after prolonging purification and trial, and of course after determined spiritual discipline, the monk experiences a kind of inner explosion that blasts his false interior self to pieces and leaves nothing but his original face, his original self before you were born, or more technically, his Buddha nature. Whatever you want to call this real self, the Purusha, spirit, of Hindu philosophy, the Tathagata, or the suchness of Zen. It is that inner I that we are discussing at present. This was the experience of a Chinese official of the Zhang dynasty, who was a lay disciple of one of the Zen masters, Chao Pen. The official was sitting quietly in his office, at leisure, with his mind at rest in what we could call simply contemplative prayer. According to the Zen theory, he had reached that point of inner maturity where the secret pressure of the inner self was ready to break unexpectedly forth and revolutionize his whole being in Satori. When one reached such a point, says the Zen masters, any fortuitous sound, word, or happening is likely to set off the explosion of the enlightenment, which consists in large part in the sudden, definitive, integral realization of the nothingness of the interior self and, consequently, the liberation of the real self, the inner I. Yet these are Western terms. The real self in Zen language is beyond the division between self and not self. Chai Pin was sitting there at peace when he heard a clap of thunder and the mind doors burst open in the depth of his silent being to reveal his original self, or suchness. The whole incident is summarized, according to the Chinese custom, in a 4-line poem, and it has rightly become immortal. Devoid of thought, I sat quietly by the desk in my official room, with my fountain mind undisturbed, as serene as water. A sudden crash of thunder, the mind doors burst open, and lo, there sits the old man in all his homeliness. As an example of spiritual experience, this is likely to perplex and even to scandalize those who expect all such things to be quite otherworldly and eternal. But it is precisely what makes it incomparable for our purpose. Suzuki, incidentally, with his usual love of irony, capitalized on the dry, unsentimental humor of the experience to contrast it with the more effective flights of amorous mysticism with which we are familiar in the West. And unfortunately, the lack of erotic or affective notes does not set this experience apart as distinctly Oriental at all. In all spirituality, there is a contrast between the affective or devotional bhakti and the intellectual anuti type of the experience, Raja Yoga. This story may have a distinctively Chinese flavor, but anyone familiar with the Cloud of Unknowing and other documents of Western apopathic mysticism will be perfectly at home with it. And so Chai Pen finds himself with his false self blown to smithereens and with the fragments carried away as though by a sudden happy cyclone. There sits Chai Pen himself, the same and yet utterly different, for it is the internal Chai Pen, one no familiar name, at once humble and mighty, terrible and funny, and utterly beyond description or comparison, because he is beyond yes and no, subject and object, self and not self. It is like the wonderful, devastating and unutterably awe of humble you, with which a Christian realizes I and the Lord are one. And when, if one tries to explain this oneness in any way possible to human speech, for instance, as the merging of two identities, one must always qualify: no like that, not like that. And that is why, of course, Suzuki wants to make quite plain that nothing is really said in this event about union with another. Well, all right. Let us assume it is perfectly natural. In any case, the event is full of significant elements and throws much light on what I have been trying to explain. The Christian approach. This discovery of the inner self plays a familiar part in Christian mysticism, but there is significant difference, which is clearly brought out by St. Augustine. In Zen, there seems to be no effort to get beyond the inner self. In Christianity, the inner self is simply a stepping stone to an awareness of God. Man is the image of God. Not only sees himself, but reveals himself to the mirror in which he is reflected. Thus, through the dark, transparent mystery of our own inner being, we can, as it were, see God through a glass. All this is, of course, pure metaphor. It is a way of saying that our being somehow communicates directly with the being of God, who is in us. If we enter into ourselves, find our true self, and then pass beyond the inner eye, we sail forth into the immense darkness in which we confront the I Am of the Almighty. The Zen writers might perhaps contend that they were interested exclusively in what is actually given in their experience, and that Christianity is superadding a theological interpretation and extrapolation on top of the experience itself. But here we come upon one of the distinctive features of Christian, Jewish, and Islamic mysticism. For us, there is an infinite metaphysical gulf between the being of God and the being of the soul, between the I of the Almighty and our own inner I. Yet, paradoxically, our inmost I exists in God and God dwells in it. But it is nevertheless necessary to distinguish between the experience of one's own inmost being and the awareness that God has revealed Himself to us in and through our inner self. We must know that the mirror is distinct from the image reflected in it. The difference rests on theological faith. Our awareness of our inner self can at least theoretically be the fruit of a purely natural and psychological purification. Our awareness of God is a supernatural participation in the light by which He reveals Himself interiorly as dwelling in our inmost self. Hence, the Christian mystical experience is not only an awareness of the inner self, but also by a supernatural intensification of faith. It is an experiential grasp of God as present within our inner self. In the interest of brevity, let us proceed without further explanation to a few classical texts, first from St. Augustine. In God, then, anything of the same nature as the soul. This mind of ours seeks to find something that is God. It seeks to find a truth not subject to change, a substance not capable of failing. The mind itself is not of this nature. It is capable of progress and decay, of knowledge and of ignorance, of remembering or forgetting. that mutability is not incident to God. Having therefore such sought to find my God in visible and corporeal things, and found him not, having sought to find his substance in myself and found him not, I perceived my God to be something higher than my soul. And therefore that I might attain to him, I thought on these things, and poured out my soul above myself. When would my soul attain to that object of its search, which is above my soul? And if my soul were not to pour itself out about itself, for were it to rest in itself, it would not see anything else beyond itself, would not for all that seek God. I have poured forth my soul above myself, and there remains no longer any being for me to attain to save my God. His dwelling place is above my soul. From thence he beholds me. From thence he governs me and provides for me. For thence he appeals to me, calls me and directs me, leads me in the way and to the end of my way. Let us turn to some text of the Rhenish Dominican mystic John Tauler. For him, the inner self, the inmost I, is the ground or center or apex of the soul. Trained in the tradition of Augustine, Tauler is, however, more concrete and less speculative than his masters, except Eckhart, whose resemblances to Oriental mysticism are being fully studied today. Here is Tauler in a passage that reminds one of Chao Pen's fountain mind. Now man with all his faculties and also with his soul recollects himself and enters into the temple, his inner self, in which in all truth he finds God dwelling and at work. Man then comes to experience God not after the fashion of the senses and of reason, or like something that one understands or reads, but he tastes him and enjoys him like something that springs up from the ground, of the soul as from its own source, or from a fountain without having been brought there. For a fountain is better than a cistern. The water of cisterns gets stale and evaporates, but the spring flows, bursts out, swells. It is true, not borrowed. It is sweet. According to the Christian mystical tradition, one cannot find one's inner center and know God there as long as one is involved in the preoccupations and desires of the outward self. Tauler, in the lines just quoted, suggests that even the depths of the soul can be troubled with what he calls natural impressions, which are sense-bound and involved in temporal conflict. Penetration into the depths of our being is then a matter of liberation from the ordinary flow of conscious and half-conscious sense impressions, but also and more definitely from the unconscious drives and the glamoring of inordained passion. Freedom to enter the inner sanctuary of our being is denied to those who are held back by dependence on self-gratification and sense satisfaction, whether it be a matter of pleasure-seeking, love of comfort, or pronounces the anger, self-assertion, pride, vanity, greed, and all the rest. John of the Cross seems to include all this freedom and more still under the one heading of faith. Faith is indeed the dark night in which we meet God. According to John of the Cross, this dark and loving knowledge, which is faith, serves as a means of divine union in this life, even as in the text, in the next life of the light of glory, serves as the feet wherewith the soul journeys of God, and love is the guide that directs it. Remain thou not therefore either partly or wholly in that which thy faculties can comprehend. I mean, be thou never willingly satisfied with that which thou understandest of God, but rather with that which thou understandest not of him. And do thou never rest in loving and having delight in that which thou understandest or feelest concerning God, but do love and have delight in that which thou canst not understand or feeling concerning him. For this, as we have said, is to seek him in faith, since God is unapproachable and hidden. However much it seem to thee that thou findest and feelst and understandest him, thou must ever hold him as hidden and serve him after a hidden manner, as one that is hidden. This is from John of the Cross. Yet at the end of the journey of faith and love, which brings us into the depths of our own being and releases us, that we may voyage beyond ourselves to God, the mystical life culminates in an experience of the presence of God that is beyond all descriptions, and which is only possible because the soul has been completely transformed in God so as to become, so to speak, one spirit with him. St. John of the Cross compares the revelation of God in the depths of our being to the awakening of the Word within us, a great stirring up supernatural divine life, in which the Almighty One who dwells in us is seen not as an inert object, but is revealed in spirit and in power as the ruler and creator and mover of all things. St. John says, even so, when a palace, the center of the soul, is thrown open, a man may see at the same time the eminence of the person who is within the palace, and also what he is doing. And it is this, as I understand it, that happens in this awakening and glance of the soul. Though the soul is substantially in God, as is every creature, he draws back from before it some of the veils and curtains which are in front of us, so that it may see of what nature he is, and then there is revealed to it, and it is able to see, though somewhat darkly, since not all the veils are thrown back. That face of his which is full of grace, and since it is moving all things by its power, there appears together with it that which is its doing, and it appears to move in them, and they in it, with continually movement. And for this reason, the soul believes that God has moved and awakened, whereas that which is moved and awakened is in reality itself. And it comes from this book, The Living Flame of Love. There are only a few characteristic texts in which Christian contemplatives have spoken of the awakening of the inner self and the consequent awareness of God. Since our inmost I is the perfect image of God, then when that I awakens, he finds within himself the presence of him whose image he is. And, by a paradox beyond all human expression, God and the soul seem to have but one single eye. They are, by divine grace, as though one single person, thy breath and life and acts as one. They breathe and live and act as one. Neither of the two is seen as object. To anyone who has full awareness of our exile from God or alienation from this inmost self and our blind wandering in the region of unlikeness, this claim can hardly seem believable. Yet it is nothing else but the message of Christ calling us to awake from sleep, to return from exile and find our true selves within ourselves, in that inner sanctuary which is His temple and His heaven. And at the end of the prodigal homecoming journey, the Father's house. My beautiful people, I know this is a very hard but in-depth understanding and study. Give yourself the time. Take it with you and listen to what is doable for you, to allow yourself to drink those words, to let the Holy Spirit bring you in that awareness. The thing is that you heard from in the beginning that we cannot work on that. It is a moment that will happen. And as I said on the end, it is Christ that calls us to awake from sleep. And we know that even as we are awake, in some meanings, we still are asleep. May God bless you and bring you to that awareness of that inmost inner. And make it bring you, and makes what it brings you, to the intimacy with the beloved, Jesus Christ. Blessings to all of you, my dear ones. This is your Pastor Yeti. Bye.